All right, so now we need to talk about the fourth pillar of underground exposure, and that is flash intensity. Now, before we jump into intensity and controlling the intensity to adjust the brightness of our shot, we need to talk a little bit about how do you know like how intense your flash is, how bright it is. Well, the way that you figure that out is through the guide number that's associated with your flash. And every flash is different, so you're going to have to look it up. The bigger the number, the brighter the output or the brighter the flash is going to be. And the way that guide number works is you take the guide number. So let's say, for example, I have a flash that has a guide number of 120. So I take 120 and I divide it by the distance in feet. So let's say I'm about 10 feet away from my subject. All right, so I take 120 divided by 10, that leaves me with 12, right? You do the math. And 12, that number that I get is my aperture that I need to use in order to get a good exposure. So if I'm 10 feet away, I dial it into 12. Now, if I don't have 12, then I just do the closest thing to 12 that I can get on my camera. Dial it in, fire off the flash, release the shutter, and, well, release the shutter, fire off the flash, and then I should have a great exposure. Now, so what does that tell me, though, like with intensity? I mean, how does 120 compare to like 80? Well, let's do the math and figure it out. So 80 at 10 feet, so 80 divided by 10 is 8. That gives me an aperture of 8. What's the difference between f8 and f11? Well, that's one stop difference. So that will either double or half the light, depending on the direction I'm going. So it kind of gives you a sense of the intensity. Now you can reverse that, and I can say, well, I've got this flash or this ISO or the guide number of 120, and I want to shoot f4. So how far away can I be to get a good exposure? Well, I can get let's see, 120 divided by 4. That's going to leave me with 30. I can be 30 feet away. And one thing I didn't mention is this is all based on ISO 100. Generally speaking, you're going to need to look at your flash's guide number, and it should have some specifications on what ISO that it's calculating that number at. But generally, it's about ISO 100. So I can shoot ISO 100, 30 feet away, f4, and that'll give me a great exposure. So that's guide number. Again, the bigger the number, the more intense, the more powerful, the more light output is going to be coming out of your flash. So typically when I'm purchasing a flash, I look for what's the highest guide number I can get at the lowest price, and that's kind of what I go for. So now you understand guide number, how to judge the intensity of your flash. Let's talk about varying that intensity. So to vary the intensity of your flash, you've got a couple of options. There's actually a handful of options. The first option is that a lot of flashes out there nowadays, especially the bigger ones and the more you pay, are going to have either a dial or a switch or something in the digital display to adjust the intensity. So for example, with my Vivitar 285s, there's a little knob that I can dial. I can take it from full, which is like 1/1, to half, to a quarter, and then down to a 16th. So those are the adjustments I have on the Vivitar. And with the Youngwo, however you pronounce that brand, I have the option to go from full to half, to a quarter, to an eighth, to a 16th, to a 32nd, to a 64th. So it's got a broad range of adjustments to vary the intensity of the light. So that's one way that you can adjust the intensity of the light. Now, let's say, you're watching this and you're like, well, my flash doesn't have those, so what do I do? Well, what you can do, there's always a way. And that's the cool thing about photography and about, just creativity in general. There is always a solution out there. If you spend some time thinking about the problem, you can come up with a solution. So what do? Well, what you can do is if you have a flash that doesn't have those variable settings, all you have to do is pop the flash multiple times. So if I fire the flash once and I need it to be twice as bright as that initial initial fire of the flash, fire it a second time. If I want it to be one stop brighter from that point, then I fire it 4 times. 2 to get me to that, the setting that I had, and then 2 more to take it 1 stop brighter. And then if I still need it to go 1 stop brighter, I'm going to fire it off 4 times from that point. So I'm going to fire it 8 times. So you get the point of kind of how this works in increasing the intensity of your flash. If you want to double it, you can do that. If you want a variation of that, then you fire it 3 times or 6 times or 5 times or whatever you need to do. If you want to go dimmer though, how do you do that? Well, what I do is I just carry a little black card, a thick black card with me, and I can use that to cover up the flash so that it blocks the light. And depending on how much I cover, will impact the intensity of the light. Pretty simple. Just requires you to think a little bit about the problem and how you can get around it with the limitations that you have. So those are 2 ways that you can adjust the intensity. Is there anything else you could do? Well, the last option that you have for adjusting the intensity of your flash is simply changing the distance. Now this one gets a little bit more tricky because to change the distance in a cave, sometimes you're really limited. I mean, you're not going to step 3 feet closer when you have to walk over a bunch of gypsum needles, or step a foot back when you're bumping into some flowstone, some really pristine flowstone. So you have to keep that in mind. But you can adjust the proximity of the flash to your subject. And how do you know how far to do that? Well, there's something called the inverse square law, which basically the way the inverse square law works is that if I start with the flash, right here, 10 feet away, and then I double my distance to 20 feet, I haven't really cut the amount of light in half. I've actually cut it by 1/4. So I go from the normal exposure, and now I've dropped it down 1/4. If I cut the distance in half by moving closer to the object, then I've just gone 4 times the amount of light. So it's sort of weird in how that works. And really, like if you're geeking out on this and you want to get a tape measure out and measure and calculate, I mean, you can do that. But I'd much rather geek out at the Comic-Con dressed up like Captain Kirk than have to spend all that time in the cave trying to figure this out. So what I do is just, with that general concept in mind, I just kind of slightly adjust the flash where it sort of feels right, fire it off. Well, that's a little too bright, so I'll move it back slightly. Just fine tune it like that. Don't sit there and try to calculate the inverse square law. There's better things to do with your time, and I'm sure all those that are shooting with you can agree. Anyway, I think that's about all you need to know at this point with how to adjust the intensity and control the brightness of your image through your flash. So you've got a lot of tools under your belt now with those 4 pillars of exposure. So with that said, we are now going to turn you loose to shoot your first assignment. So let's head on over to the assignment. I'm going to walk through it, and we're going to talk about what you need to do to get this first assignment. And you better do it. Do not turn this video off and just go on to the next one. If you don't complete this assignment, first of all, shame on you. And second, you're not going to learn, and you're not going to grow, and you're not going to improve. This first assignment is going to be, you're going to have to push yourself. You're going to have to restrain yourself from maybe taking some creative liberties. This one is really about technical things and about mastering the technique of exposure as opposed to getting a really good shot. So keep that in mind as you move to the first assignment. Let's go ahead and walk through this and then get you going. And again, you better shoot the freaking thing. Okay. All right, let's head over to the assignment. All right, assignment number 1 for you minimalist cave photographers out there. Let's go ahead and read through this assignment overview. So first of all, now that you have learned about creating a good exposure underground, it is time to apply what you've learned. Don't worry about creating an amazing image. Right now, we're just trying to create a picture that's not too light, not too dark, but just right. That's going to be the biggest challenge here because naturally you're going to want to try to make a good shot. Do not worry about that. Just focus on exposure. Anyway, So I want you to experiment with what we've learned in this lesson by setting up the shots listed below and adjusting first the aperture to see what happens, then adjust the ISO, then adjust the flash intensity, and then finally adjust the flash distance. And then adjust all four to kind of fine-tune that and come up with the best shot. Okay, so let's take a look at what you're going to be doing here, this checklist. And it's important you check off each of these items. So exposure control, aperture, ISO, flash intensity, flash distance. As you shoot the list below, you will want to collect images that are too dark, too bright, and just right. Do not use the screen on your camera to judge exposure. Very often that screen doesn't reflect the actual exposure, so it's good to have a little bit of a buffer. And one other thing, flashlight falls off. In other words, there will be areas that are dark and areas that are light and areas that are just right. So when shooting the assignment below, decide before you shoot what is your primary subject. Is it a single formation, a caver, the back wall, the middle of the passage? What is it? So focus your attention on getting that, your primary subject, to be the right exposure. As light falls off in other areas, don't really worry about those. Focus on your subject, what you're trying to get lit up. All right, so here's what you're going to be shooting. First of all, I want you to shoot a formation or something that's relatively small, and then I want you to vary the aperture several times on that. Keep all of the other exposure controls, the shutter speed, the ISO, and the flash intensity, the same. You're just varying the aperture. Next, photograph a formation or something relatively small, and then you're varying the ISO several times. Keep all the other exposure controls the same. And then you'll do the same thing with flash intensity. And then last of all, you'll play with flash distance on that small formation or small thing in the cave. Then what you're going to do is move to a small room. And again, you're going to play with, first you're going to focus on just adjusting the aperture to fine tune the exposure. Then you're going to play with the shutter speed, or not the shutter speed, the ISO. You're going to play with the flash intensity and the flash distance in the small room. And then last of all, you'll move to, a caver doing something. And again, playing with each of those controls individually to kind of see and master the effect that control has on your overall shot, and figuring out where is the sweet spot for different cave subjects, passages, people, formations, that sort of thing. So I want you to play with the whole gamut. And then the last thing that you need to do in this assignment, there is a reflection, and there will always be a reflection in the assignments, because you need to look back and say what worked, what didn't work, how do I lock in on what did work, and how do I learn from what didn't work so I don't make that same mistake moving forward. So here's a reflection. First of all, you're going to compare your shots in each of those groups that we've listed above and ask yourself, did adjusting the aperture cause you any problems with focus that you need to be aware of in the future? Is there an aperture range that is safe to use? And maybe you find that, if I ever shoot at IS or at aperture like 2.0 or 1.4 or 4.0, then I really run the risk of messing up the focus. So that could be a danger zone kind of mental, something to mentally keep track of for you. So that's the first thing. Next, did adjusting the ISO cause any problems that you need to be aware of? Kind of the same thing as the aperture. Last of all, did adjusting the flash intensity give you the results you were thinking? Or did you find that cutting it in half or a quarter seemed darker than you thought? Did popping the flash multiple times brighten the image as much as you thought? What do you need to do next time to make sure you get the effect you want? And then last of all, did adjusting the flash distance impact how your shadows looked? Also, did the light intensity change to the degree you thought it would? Kind of make note of what you need to do next time to get the desired effect. So that's the first part of the reflection. Next part, next time you go underground to get a good exposure, well, where will your starting point be with regards to your aperture, ISO, and flash intensity? What will you attempt to adjust first, and where will your fallback be if you need more or less light? And then last of all, what worked and what didn't work when it came to focusing your camera underground. All right, and one last thing on the assignment. There's another page that has a exposure log, and I would keep this. It's going to be a pain to do underground, especially if you're in a muddy cave. But do the best you can to keep track of each shot you do, what settings you used, because this is going to help later on as you reflect to remember which settings you used in your camera and what you were playing with, what you were trying out, which part of the assignment you were working on. It's going to be really valuable to have that. So the last thing that I'll mention that I haven't really mentioned is focus. One of the things that I do when I'm shooting underground is wherever the point of critical focus is, have someone shine a light on those parts, and then on the viewfinder in the back of my camera, I will zoom in and make sure that that is locked on, dead focused. And then I can zoom back out, don't touch anything, and then fire it off. So that's an idea for you to play with when you're focusing underground, and then the person can turn their light off and move out of the shot. So that's the assignment. Again, like I said, I think it's going to be a challenge for you, because the challenge is going to be in putting the reins on and saying, I'm only here to focus on exposure. You're not worried about getting an amazing shot. If that happens, then great. But the primary focus is mastering your exposure. So go out, have a lot of fun with this assignment, even though it's going to be a little tedious. Enjoy the moment, enjoy being underground, and I'll see you in the next lesson.